Corinthians 12, 2 Corinthians 12. In chapters 10 and 11, the Apostle Paul has given what you would call defense of his ministry, and it's a shame that he had to do that, because of all the people, the Corinthians ought to have known that he was a true apostle. He started the congregation there, and they owed him a great debt of gratitude, or at least they should. But there were some that came in that were saying things about him and trying to accuse and trying to undermine what he was doing. And in a lot of ways, when you look at it even today, of all of the New Testament, the part of the New Testament that catches the most criticism is often the writings of Paul. And so in some ways it's, obviously God's wisdom that put this section in there to remind us and to inform us of what all Paul did, to show what he gave up and how that he suffered and how that he worked in order to be who he was. And so we are coming toward an end of this section. Of course, there's only this chapter and next to the whole book, but this defense of his ministry is where we're going from here. Chapter 12 is a pretty famous chapter. It's the chapter that talks about his thorn in the flesh. And so I don't want to talk about all the theories in regard to that, but I do want to throw some things out when we come to that point. But just some things to look at in that regard. So, chapter 12, verse 1 says, I must go on boasting. Though there is nothing to be gained by it, I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ Jesus who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man was caught up into paradise. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. On behalf of this man I will boast. But on my own behalf I will not boast, except of my weaknesses. Though I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool. For I would be speaking the truth, but I refrain from it, so that no one may think of me more than he sees in me or hears from me. So to keep me from being too elated by the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from being too elated. Let's stop right there. Paul says that he would continue on to his boasting. And of course, as he has said time and again, that boasting is foolish. And what I give the term to this, chapters 10, 11, and 12, is Paul's fool speech, because he calls himself a fool for speaking this way, because it's not generally right to talk about your own accomplishments and to boast of those things. But Paul doing so was to reinforce what he was doing, where he came from, the authority by which he did it, and to show the extent to which he had worked for and strived for the Corinthian church and the other churches, and to give a reason why he had the right, the power, the authority. Maybe right's not the right word, but the power and the authority given to him by God to do and say what he did. And so he said, of all these other things, I'll go on to visions and revelations. And he says, he speaks in third person, because I don't think there's anybody that reads this and thinks he's talking about somebody else. I think everybody clearly believes he's talking about himself when he says that by being caught up into third heaven, being able to see things that he's not even allowed to talk about. Now that's kind of curious as to what all that would be. And what was it? He wasn't able to talk about it, so we don't have it recorded. And so to speculate on what it was, I guess is immaterial or pointless. My wonder, just my 2 cents to throw in there, is if it might be some things along the lines of what would be later given to the Apostle John in the book of Revelation. And the reason why I say that is because, it sounds like a similar circumstance to what John found himself in the book of Revelation on the island of Patmos. But we don't know that, but we just know that Paul said the things that were revealed to him were to strengthen him, and that they were so amazing that he's not even allowed to tell about them. And so he's able to get those things. And he said that happened to him 14 years ago. And of course, if it is things along the lines of the Revelation, those are coming many years later than even Paul writing this. And so he may have been included into things long before they happened. There also may be specifically things relating to Paul and the things that Paul was going to go through his missionary journeys and such. We don't know when that is, that being caught up into the third heaven. At least one plausible time could be. In Acts chapter 14, Paul is stoned in Lystra and left for dead. And certainly in a moment of being stoned and left for dead, being in the body, out of the body, not quite sure where you are, would maybe be at that point. But it doesn't have to be. It could have been in a dream in the night or whenever. But at least that's a plausible explanation possibly as to when that could be. Not knowing where he was, but knowing what he heard and saw is what is important. He says, I don't know whether I was in the body or out of the body, but yet God knows. God knows where he was. God knows his circumstance. And God can bear witness to what actually really happened to him. And so he heard things he can't tell. But what will he boast about? Not that he was privileged to do that, but that God was powerful enough to put him there. I'll boast about the things that show my weakness. And those are the things that show God's strength and show how God helped Paul through his weakness. And so it is of great importance for that. It's later in this text that says, when God speaks to him, that strength is made perfect in weakness. And Paul, says that when he is weak, then he is strong. And realizing that strength comes through personal weakness, because it is in personal weakness that we rely upon God. And the more that we let God take over, the stronger we'll actually be. So, he said so that these revelations that came to me, so that I would not become too elated, you can look at that word elated and say too prideful, whatever, that he would not, that he needs something to ground him, needs something to keep him humble in that. And so a thorn in the flesh was given to him, and he's called a messenger from Satan to harass him. Any questions or comments up to that point? Anybody want to interject something, ask something, or whatever? Okay. When we look at this and notice, on the discussion questions, I have, why was Paul's thorn in the flesh given to him? Well, you see that in the text. Why is it that he gets this? So that it won't be too elated. In other words, keep him humble, keep him grounded.
Did you ever wonder if the thorn in the flesh might have been his conscience from what he had done from his earlier life?
I think it's along those lines.
I know we'll never know, it doesn't matter.
Hold pause on your comment, because that's where I'm going to go next. Anybody else have anything before that? Because I have a section on the outline, a note on the thorn in the flesh, of some things that we do know versus things we don't know, and that's at the heart of what we're going to talk about. Anything else? Okay, yeah, you all want to get to talk about the thorn in the flesh, don't you? All right, let's do that then. On there, I have some things that I have a note on the thorn on the flesh. I first of all want to say we don't know what it is. We're not told what it is. But I think that we have some hints as to what it is. We don't know. Many think it could be something like poor eyesight or a physical ailment that inhibited his strength, inhibited his ability. I personally don't think it was that. But a lot of bright people smarter than me think it was. So I just note that a lot of people think that. I'm more inclined to be along the lines of what Lisa was saying. The thing we do know is who gave it to him. Well, God gave it to him. So God gave it to him, but it was a messenger from Satan. Well, it's a messenger from Satan, and the messenger from Satan is there to harass him, but the messenger from Satan doesn't make him sin, okay? Because God wouldn't tempt him, God wouldn't make him sin. And so, the things about that is a messenger brings messages, okay? A messenger brings messages, and so the kind of messages that Satan would bring is a lot like what Lisa was talking about. And under the note of the thorn of the flesh, things like worry, fear, doubt, guilt, painful memories, like killing Stephen and other things, could very well be those kind of messages. Also, when we see that Paul prays for it to be removed, what's God's response? My grace is sufficient for you. And so, I'll just be blunt. You don't have to have grace to be forgiven of bad eyesight. Okay?
Just on another note on that, I don't know what it is, but you can, something benign like pain, like a physical infirmity, Satan can work with you.
Oh, yes. Satan can.
It can work in your mind,
Mm-hmm.
and that could cause you to do something that have a worry
Right.
you're not supposed to have. And so that still could be the way God's saying, my grace is sufficient for you. I could see it either way.
Right.
Because
Right.
even though the physical thing is not sin,
Right.
Satan can play on that. And
Can work, yes. Yeah, he works with that. And there's nothing like pain for Satan to work with. And so God's statement of grace is being sufficient for my estimation, and that's all it is. What could grace be in reference to but Paul not be guilty of? And merely those things that he's already been forgiven of, like the stoning of Stephen and other things. And along those lines of being guilt-ridden over those things, he talks about being the chief of sinners and other things throughout his writings. And so God's grace being sufficient for those things he's been forgiven of. And so in that, whatever it is, in whatever avenue it is, whether it's a physical ailment, whether it's an emotional thing, whether it is whether it's dreams or nightmares or just whatever it would amount to, first of all, we don't know. And second of all, whatever it is not something that God was going to hold him guilty for, because it couldn't be removed from him. He couldn't get away from that. Whatever it was, there was no way for him to do it. And of course, we recognize that God's not going to tempt us larger than we can bear. And so there is a way out of it. And well, God's grace is going to be sufficient. And of course, God's grace is sufficient for forgiving him of the things he's already been forgiven of. And very much, it is important for us to recognize that. I'm speaking tonight at 36th Street, the 36th Street congregation in Vienna, right next to Parkersburg. My lesson tonight is on the sin of unforgiveness. I'm going to use it this morning because I think it's certainly relevant to all of us. I'm speaking it there tonight, speaking it here this morning. And that concept dovetails really nice with this text. There probably won't be time in either sermon this morning or tonight to talk about 2 Corinthians 12. But the idea of Paul being unable to shake whatever this thorn is, but God saying you're forgiven, is one of the big challenges in regard to forgiveness. Often, the most difficult person to forgive is yourself. And that's the case. And I just gave you the conclusion of my sermon this morning. I'm going to say it a little differently than that. But essentially, a lot of times the hardest person to forgive is yourself. And I think there's an element of that. Not that Paul is unforgiven. I believe Paul is forgiven. But there's a struggle with what he's got going on, whatever that thorn is. Like I say, it could well be a physical ailment. And yet those things that trouble him and cause him difficulty. And he's prayed 3 times for it to go away, and it hasn't. But God's grace is sufficient for him, and he's taken care of in that, but yet he wants rid of it. And so it is a statement of God's grace more than it is anything else. And so with that in mind, Paul can't shake the thorn, and sometimes there's things in our life that we just simply cannot shake. We can forgive, and we are to try to forget, but sometimes forgetting is an impossibility. It is a human impossibility to forget. Now, if you want to remember it, you might forget it. Okay? We find a way to do that. But there are just some things that have been done to us, or that we've witnessed being done, or we've known of them being done, that we cannot ever forget. Doesn't mean we failed to forgive. It just means we cannot ever shake that. We need to treat whoever has sought forgiveness from us well. We need to treat them as forgiven. But sometimes forgetting is impossible because we can't erase everything from our minds. And so Paul can't shake this thorn in the flesh. It's there, and whatever it is, it's with him. And so, yes, sir. It's a struggle. It's a struggle. Garth Brooks had a song about marriage. We bury the hatchet, believe the handle's sticking out. Sometimes we only kind of forget stuff, and when it becomes convenient, we grab it back. And so, yeah, that's a challenge. It's a real challenge that we do that, and we sometimes latch hold of what is there, and forgetting for us a lot of times is impossible. It's just that we have to do our best to treat them as if we've forgotten. And I'll say, I don't think any of us ever master that completely. I think we as humans will struggle over those things. And even sometimes when we think we've figured it out, it still creeps back. And so what do? We have to do the best we can. And be thankful, though, that God casts our sin as far as the east is from the west. As Psalm 51 tells us, that he can wash us whiter than snow. He can get rid of it and remove it from us. And so be thankful that God does that. The thing about it is we struggle with that. Certainly. Yeah, that we get forgiven in the measure we forgive others. And yeah, that gives us motivation to do what Carol is saying, that certainly we do that. And that's the thing. It's a struggle. And sometimes forgiveness comes in waves, so to speak, that we can forgive, but we have to, trust has to be earned back. It doesn't mean just because we've forgiven somebody that we immediately trust them completely, because we've got to be careful. We've got to, trust and then verify. I mean, I think all of us have known that, you have teenagers in particular. One of the things I emphasize to my kids many, many times is you can establish a level of integrity and maturity, and that can all be gone in a hurry. That can be gone. That the way that you're viewed and the trust and confidence that people have in you can be gone real fast. It can take years to build up, but it can be gone real fast. So we need to maintain and guard our integrity, guard the reputation we have, because we can destroy that really, really quickly. And so it's very important that we recognize that. Well, if someone has, because people fail, it takes a while to build that back. And especially, we may forgive them, we may not hold that against them, but that doesn't mean we need to trust them to the extent that we did before. I mean, that's just the way it's going to be. I mean, how many times are you going to have to, continue to enable people that have done wrong? Yes, we've got to forgive them 77 times or 490 times, depending on which text you look at as far as that goes. Yes, we forgive them every time they look for forgiveness, but it doesn't mean we need to keep fueling and enabling their sin. Tom? Yeah, exactly. A good for instance of that is certainly if you've got a family member that you know is really struggling with drugs, and you may forgive them, and then they come to you and say, I need my electric bill paid, and you're going to help them. You might have before handed them the cash to go pay the bill. Okay? Because they were your family and you trusted their word. But if you know that they've struggled with doing things with their money that they know they shouldn't, then maybe you may call and say, let me call the electric company, and you pay it directly. Because you're wiser about what you're doing. And that doesn't mean you haven't forgiven them, but that you've got to be careful, because you want that money to go to the electric company and not them to go do something else with it. And so you've got to be that way. Of course, Tom recognizes, he does much of our benevolence work, as a benevolence deacon. And you've got to be careful of that. People want you to hand them money. Well, the thing about it is often you need to be wiser about it. Not hand them money, but directly deal with whatever it is. If they say, we need groceries, well then you say, give me a list. And you go get those things and you hand them to them. It's harder for them to abuse a gallon of milk and a loaf of bread than something else, and make sure they get the need met instead of just handing cash. And that's very important, in which you verify and you follow through with what is there. So doesn't mean you haven't forgiven them, but you're more wary and careful of what you do with them. Yes, Charlotte? I think you're right. We are wiser in dealing with those individuals. Right. Yeah. And Jesus told his disciples to be as wise as serpents, but as harmless as doves. You know, be wise about what you're doing. Be careful about what you're doing. And a lot of that involves about how you treat people. You know, certainly we are to always forgive, to never withhold forgiveness, but that doesn't mean we need to hand them a bunch of cash and our car keys. You know, those are different things entirely. Paul pleaded 3 times for this to be removed, and it wasn't. And it shows also, this is another great example of unanswered prayers. Not everybody in the Bible, even righteous people, had their prayers answered in the way that they wanted. You know, he prayed, God said no. Not going to remove it. So everything we really want and pray for, we should not expect everything we really want and pray for to come the way that we ask for it. I would dare say a lot of the things that Paul prayed for came about, but not everything came about. Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane prayed if there's any other way for his cup to pass from him, and there wasn't. And so, if Jesus doesn't get everything that he asked for, and Paul doesn't get everything that he asked for, then we probably shouldn't expect that either. God's power is made perfect in weakness, and the reason being is so that God can work through us. You know, you remember the story of Gideon, and how Gideon was the man that was threshing wheat inside a wine press. In other words, he was hiding out. That's where you wouldn't normally thresh wheat in there. He was hiding from the Midianites. And God said, I want you to deliver my people. And so he gathered up the people he could to go off to fight. And he got several thousand, tens of thousands. And God said, that's too many of them. And he asked them, everybody that's afraid, head back home. And he lost more than half of them. They were afraid. They went back home because they knew they were outnumbered. 120 or so thousand of the Midianites, and it was about 4 to 1. Asked the ones that were afraid, and many went home. And God said, that's still too many. And at that point, it was about 10,000 to 120,000, roughly a 12 to 1 margin. And God said, that's too many. Need to weed some out. Took them down to a stream and asked them to drink, and only those that got down on their, most of them got down on their belly. The ones that were down just knelt down and pulled the water to them, were more ready for action, and they were kept. 300 of them. 300. Going to go against 120,000. God, that's good, right there. And I'm paraphrasing that. But it brings those 300, and what do? They don't come out with the latest piece of military hardware. He says, you got to take 2 things. A trumpet and a pitcher with a lantern in it. Torches. Torch and trumpets. And we know what happened, don't we? He divided the group up into 3, 100 in each group. They sounded the trumpets, broke the pitchers, held up the lights, and the Midianites in the darkness killed each other. Because they couldn't see who they were fighting, and they killed each other in the middle of the night. Well, what happened? Well, God's power is made great in something really small. 300 against 120,000. Nobody looked at that victory and said that Gideon did it in a way, that Gideon, those men, won that battle. It's God won that battle. God deserved the credit. When they marched around the walls of Jericho, one time each day for 7 days and then 7 times on the seventh day and the walls fell down? Everybody knew who did that. God did that. And so God's power is made great in obedience, in weakness of individuals. When we rely on God, it comes about better. God's ability to knock down walls is much greater than ours. You know, we could hit it with a battering ram and might chip off some rocks, but God can make the whole wall fall down. And that being the difference. God's power is made perfect, complete in our weakness. And so he says, I would boast all the more gladly of weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. And then he says in verse 10, for the sake of Christ, then I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. That seems like an absolute oxymoron. When I'm weak, then I'm strong. How is that? How is strength in weakness? It only makes sense because of God. Because the more I rely on Him, the more I actually am. You know, 10% of God is much better than 100% of me. What it comes down to, really. And 100% of me, a lot of times, doesn't have enough room for God. And so, it's important for us that whatever we do, yes, to work at it, but yet realize that when we are humble, when we are moldable, when we are flexible, and we allow God to work with us, that in our strength can only be achieved through the weakness that we allow God to take over for. And so that only comes about in our moment of letting God take over. Tom?
I've heard some people sat in classes where people said they didn't believe his thorn in the flesh was something in the flesh. The Judaizing teachers that God put in front of him for an opposition that he had throughout his career.
And it's a possibility. It's a possibility. Yeah, it is. It certainly is. There are a number of things. I want to give you a couple conclusions on the thorn in the flesh. Whatever it is, you can take whatever your difficulty is, whatever your thorn in the flesh is, and stick it in the paradigm, and it fits. Whatever your personal struggle is, stick it in there. As long as it's not a sin, sin, then certainly you need to deal with that. But whatever your personal struggle is, whatever your difficulty, whether it be an illness, whether it be a disability, whether it be a memory, whether it be family members that are difficult for you to deal with, whether it be agitators at work or wherever, you stick it in there in the equation, and it all works out the same, that God's grace is sufficient, that strength is made perfect in weakness. And that those things that cause us to rely on God more will ultimately make us better.
It's your reaction to it. Other people can gain strength from how you deal with it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Watch how you deal with problems and situations in your own life.
Yeah.
So not only is it a blessing to you, you could go either way. You could allow it to make you become bitter. You leave the church, that's an extreme example, but it could change your life for the worse, or it could change your life for the better.
Mm-hmm.
Depending on how you do it.
Yeah. Certainly. A lot of times those that have the deepest scars in their life because of the things they've gone through are able to best help those that are able to learn from them. One of the people that I knew from a previous congregation was a Green Beret in Vietnam, and went through some very difficult things and ended up having to do some things that he certainly still lives with today. But yet, it makes him one of the kindest and gentlest individuals you'd ever encounter because of what he's done. And I know very few people that love kids and support kids better than he does. And I've talked with him on numerous occasions about the challenges he went through and other things. And my statement is always to him, those scars are what make you who you are. And there's nothing you can do to change that. There's nothing to go back and replay it. And what you did, probably almost everyone else would have done the same thing in the same set of circumstances. And very clearly to me, he struggles with a thorn in the flesh of remembering. And yet, it makes him a better person. Could have destroyed him. So many people like him is destroyed. And yet, it's made him better. And so, we need to learn from that. Brian?
I think when you talk about forgiveness, it's not a temporary thing or something for when you rest with.
Mm-hmm.
But you always want to remember one thing.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't forgive, then those that we offend are not going to forgive.
Oh, yeah, definitely,
That
certainly.
right there is enough that everybody should understand what forgiveness is.
Right,
To keep picking or saying this and that, it's over.
right. Yeah,
You won't
certainly.
forget it, but you'll never bring it back up to encourage others.
Right, and that's very important. Okay, verse 11 and following. I have been a fool. You forced me to it. For I ought to have been commended by you, for it is not all inferior to, I'm not all inferior to these super apostles, even though I am nothing. The signs of a true apostle were performed among you with utmost patience, with signs and wonders and mighty works. If you'll notice, if you were here through VBS, especially on Sunday night, Steve talked about the things, the miracles of the Bible, and they were often called, and he listed those three things right there. Signs, wonders, and mighty works were the things that they did. And Paul performed those among the Corinthians. For in what you were less favored than the rest of the churches, except that I myself did not burden you, forgive me this wrong. Here for the third time I am ready to come to you, and I will not be a burden. For I seek not what is yours, but you. For children are not obligated to save up for their parents, but parents for their children. I will most gladly spend and be spent for your souls. If I love you more, am I to be loved less? But granting that I myself did not burden you, I was crafty, you say, and got the better of you by deceit. Did I take advantage of you, though any of those whom I sent to you? I urged Titus to go and sent the brother with him. Did Titus take advantage of you? Did we not act with the same spirit? Did we not take the same steps? Have you been thinking all along that we have been defending ourselves to you? It is in the sight of God that we have been speaking in Christ, and all for your upbuilding. Beloved, for I fear that perhaps when I come I may find you not as I wish, and that you may find me not as you wish, that perhaps there may be quarreling, jealousy, anger, hostility, slander, gossip, conceit, and disorder. I fear that when I come again, my God may humble me before you, and I may have to mourn over many of those who sinned earlier and have not repented of the impurity, sexual immorality, and sensuality that they have practiced. Paul said, all these things have come, that I've done these things for your benefit. I didn't take advantage of you. I didn't use you. And I'm not like those super apostles. And of course, he's using that sarcastically, as we've noted over the last 3 chapters. He's not talking about the real apostles. He's talking about those that claim to be apostles. And pointing out that they're using, they're manipulating, they're trying to angle against you, but not him. He said, Titus didn't use you, and those others that have been sent through me did not. He said, I'm afraid that when I come there, what I might find. And I'm afraid that God may humble me in front of you. And you know what that means? He's going to be really upset. He is telling them, in essence, my reaction when I get there is going to be determined on what you do in the meantime. What you do is going to make all the difference as to how I react to you. Gives them some things that they are to not be a part of. The quarreling, the jealousy, the anger. It says that they're to get rid of such things as impurity and sexual immorality and sensuality. They're to get rid of those things, to move past those things, to stop them in order for his arrival. And in their maturity, he's hoping that they would do that. Any questions or comments out of this, at the end of this chapter? Whatever the thorn in the flesh was, we don't know, but whatever it was, we can learn that God's grace is sufficient. And God will help us through and make us better. Paul was made better by the thorn in the flesh. And the difficulties, the challenges, the troubles that we find are there to help us and to make us better. And so we need to let that take place. Thank you. We will be doing chapter 13 next week. There's an outline for chapters 12 and 13 on the podium in the back. So both of them are there. We'll do 13 next week.